human mind is like a computer. No matter how efficient it may be, its reliability is only as great as the information fed into it.
That's a campaign promise.
Tell us the truth. Tell us the truth.
We mandate that the truth be told. You're hearing it.
TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're still in hour number one of this live broadcast. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're live and direct for the next 2 hours here on TNT, Today's News Talk. Very pleased that you could rejoin us. We're going to do a hard pivot right now back to the Middle East. I'm going to welcome on to the program veteran journalist Leila Hatoum. She's on the ground in Beirut, Lebanon. She's been following and covering events very closely since the beginning of this latest wave of hostilities, which began on October 7th. We don't need to rehash everything that's happened since then, but focus on what's happening now and what's likely to happen in the coming weeks and months. Let's welcome her onto the stage right now. Leila, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and good evening from Beirut.
Good evening to you too. It's been a while since we've last spoken on air, Leila. A lot has happened. I think the last conversation we had, you were in Jordan with the airdrop for Gaza campaign. Now, what's transpired over the last week is very disturbing, to say the least, and I really want to start this conversation with what is happening, what is building up in southern Gaza at the Rafah border crossing. If you can give us your assessment of this situation. We're very concerned about this, as everybody is, that this could be just really something that pushes the whole thing right over the edge. But go ahead, Leila.
Yeah, it has been a long while, so lots of has happened over the past 2 to 3 weeks, and you do have to understand that any shift in events can change the whole narrative. 3 weeks ago, we were expecting an expansion of war. The Israelis were trying to bombard around Gaza city and in the peripheries. They did not go full throttle against the Gazans in Rafah. Tens and hundreds have been killed almost on a weekly basis. The thing is that had the Israelis wanted to do a full throttle attack, they would have done it directly instead of giving 2 weeks notice. So that made us think, like, what's happening on the side? And then we noticed there were negotiations happening in Cairo, and those negotiations were concluded. There was a time of, if you have noticed, calm kind of reaction from either the Israeli side or the axis of resistance across. And today we had the meetings between the negotiators in Paris. We had the head of Mossad, David Barnea, going to Paris to resume the negotiations. And then you had the negotiators on behalf of Hamas also negotiating on the release of detainees. However, what we understood from those meetings is that there will be no naming of the or names or numbers of the detainees that will be released from the Israeli side in exchange of Hamas's detainees. What they need to agree on at the moment is an action plan for the release of the detainees. And this, as they said, basically, as according to sources, it could take days or even up to 2 weeks. Now, why do they stick to the 2 weeks thing? It's because Ramadan is in 2 weeks and a half from now. Ramadan is a holy month for the Muslims. And I had told everybody over the past week, keep your eye on Jerusalem this week. Anything that happens in Jerusalem today during the Friday prayers, you will understand that the Israelis mean escalation or not. The Israelis kept it short. They did not do harassments as they usually do during Friday prayers. They continued to ban young Palestinians from reaching Al-Aqsa Mosque to pray over there. Remember that the Israelis had issued their own decree that no Palestinian under the age of 50 should be allowed to go into Al-Aqsa Mosque as of Ramadan. This is a big no-no for Palestinians because Al-Aqsa Mosque is very holy to them. So we expected some riots to happen. However, things were mitigated, which tells me one thing. Everybody's calming the game at the moment to see the result of the negotiations. The Americans are supporting this kind of negotiation for a reason. The Americans did not bank on the Yemenis to last, the Iraqis to go in and kill 8 American soldiers, and the Lebanese resistance to last, as long as Hamas is lasting also in Gaza. Depletion war without taking part in expanding the war. And this hurts them more than it hurts them when they have an open war where they can go and bombard as they please. So they're pushing for those negotiations. And I think we're going to see a tit for tat for the next 2 weeks unless something changes in the narrative so far. So I don't expect an escalation this week, at least this week. We have to wait till next week keep an eye on Jerusalem every Friday, because during Friday prayers, it will make it or break it for this kind of negotiations and the change in narrative. However, I have to remind you of one thing when it comes to Rafah. We've all heard what the former, basically the former Army General and Minister Benny Gantz said. He said, we're going to continue to fight, and we're going to go deep into enemy territories. We're going to attack Rafah. These are void threats that usually army generals do during negotiations time to push the negotiations towards what they want. So it's all void talk until basically we see the result of negotiations.
Sure. And also, it just also gives you an indication. There's people that are talking about Benny Gantz as if he's some sort of dovish alternative to Bibi Netanyahu, but he is as hardcore a Zionist as there is in Israel. So I think we can put that talk to rest right now. What's really concerning here, and I want to get your opinion on this as well, Egypt building these sort of structures in this area. I don't know if you've had a look at that. That a lot of people will look at that and say, well, is Egypt doing this as a contingency plan, or is the United States, Egypt, and Israel making some, let's say, behind the scenes negotiations, or is there collusion behind the scenes? In other words, do all of these parties know something that's going to happen that we haven't been told yet? What are your thoughts on this?
I highly doubt that all the parties know what's going to happen later on or what's happening at the moment. Each one has a piece of the puzzle. The ones who are waging this war or pushed for that war are the Americans, so they have the most pieces of the puzzle. The Israelis come next, and then basically the Arab world comes last, as usual when it comes to wars over here, which is really sad. But when it comes to the cement wall structures that have been constructed by the Egyptians along the Rafah side, from their side of the Rafah border crossing and along that wall, you have to understand, if you look at it from the satellite, this area does not fit enough Palestinians. It's like only tens of thousands. You have over 1.3 million people living in Rafah at the moment and South Gaza. You have 2.4 million Palestinians living in all of Gaza Strip. So if the rumors are correct, they would have been building something basically in a different shape and larger scale to accommodate at least half of that size, which is not happening. What the Egyptians are actually doing, they're building a lengthy wall. I think it's fortifying their first lines of defense. They're anticipating possibility of war. And if you look at it from a military side, it's always best to have two lines of defense before you actually engage in war. That deters the enemy from going in. They can only go by sky, and Egypt does have the air force and the air defense systems to actually fight that until basically their army engages. That's the first thing. The second thing is that don't forget that the Rafah border crossing from the Egyptian side was bombarded 3 times by the Israelis. They had to fix the cement walls over there. And there's a small square shape of about 4 kilometers by 4 kilometers in size. And that was basically to cater for the 10 cities. There are militaries in the area, NGOs, including IRC and the International Federation for the Red Cross, IFRC. So these people need an area to operate from if anything happens. At the same time, I have to mention this, and this is very, very critical. As a reporter, we received information from somebody from Jordan the same day the story about the Egyptian constructions being done on the ground that was launched by the Sinai organization that's based in UK, by the way. And that source in Jordan claimed the same story about what Egypt is doing, but in Jordan. And we asked him to send the videos and photos that he claimed that he had. And he said, no, I will only send it to a Palestinian or Jordanian reporter. We provided him with a number for a Jordanian reporter, and we haven't received anything as of now. And that's basically a week and a half ago, which is really crazy because somebody is trying to hype that narrative to create the fear factor, to push towards those negotiations. When you create the fear factor that Rafah is going to be bombarded, people are going to face exodus or a second Nakba, that creates pressure on the negotiators themselves, even from the Hamas side.
That's interesting that you bring in these details because it does look like Israel, at least on the U.S. Israeli side, they're really building up a lot of pressure to get leverage for these negotiations. So the statements by Benny Gantz, what you're just describing here, it does sound like that's exactly what's happening. So we should be very cautious not to run away with assumptions when we see reports like this, and we appreciate your analysis on that. I just wanted one last thing on Rafah, Leila. If Israel does come good with its threats to attack Rafah on Ramadan. What will the result of that be? Because one, obviously, you talked about the potential for a clash at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, how that would inflame the Muslim world, the Middle East, the Arab world, but attacking Palestinians in Rafah, unarmed Palestinians, during Ramadan, what sort of reaction could we expect if this happens?
You have to understand, when I'm explaining details and situations, I'm not giving justification to any side. War is possibly going to escalate going forward. I actually believe that there's going to be an escalation unless there's a change in the narrative when it comes to negotiations. Because remember, the axis of resistance, they said from the beginning, the whole thing that we're doing at the moment is to reach a possible solution that the Palestinians will be okay with it. And if the Palestinians are okay with that solution, that's fine. But when it comes to Rafah, any attack on Rafah with 1.3 million people over there, at the scale that Benny Gantz is talking about, going deep into enemy territories, wiping them out, doesn't matter what happens, that means a change of behavior on the battlefield, in the battlefield in Gaza, and that basically could push the axis of resistance to engage in a fully expanded war. And what happens in Jerusalem, that's a whole different scenario. Any escalation on the ground could lead to a third intifada. Remember, for the past, since 2015, we've been riding on the wave of a third intifada. Things have been building up since 2015 until now. So any escalation in Jerusalem could lead to a third intifada. You cannot contain it anymore, especially that you also have other cities across the occupied West Bank, occupied Palestinian territories. Jenin, major fights are happening on daily basis since October 8th until today. Tol Kerem, Ramallah, and other cities as well are fighting, but there's media blackout. So I do expect either a possibility of an intifada if there's an escalation in Jerusalem, or if the Israelis attack Rafah, there will be an expanded war in the region. However, I'm still banking on the result of the negotiations that are happening. Fingers crossed. They're saying 2 weeks. That means we have 2 weeks of tit for tat and trenches war. That's it.
And then the other front, obviously, that would be might be activated is, of course, the one that's very close to you, which is South Lebanon. So there's been very disturbing escalations there. There's a lot of accusations about American involvement in the Israeli military operation as well, and hitting targets and civilians in South Lebanon. What has transpired over the last 2 weeks? If you can give us an update and tell us what you think the sort of situation report is there in South Lebanon right now. It's very much tied to what we're seeing unfolding in Gaza, of course. But go ahead, Leila.
No, yes, definitely. You have to understand the southern Lebanese front, which is northern occupied Palestine front. That's the hottest zone at the moment that hasn't fully expanded. There is war happening. The Israelis have lost dozens of soldiers between killed and or injured over the past 2 weeks alone. The Israelis had increased their attacks against Lebanese civilians. The total number of Lebanese civilians that have been killed by the Israelis so far has exceeded 42 until now. And at the same time, Hezbollah has retaliated, and the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, he vowed in one of his most recent speeches that this time it will be blood for blood. The Israelis will be paying for the blood that they spilled by their own blood. And that caused a stir among the Israelis, especially those who remember 1996 war against Lebanon, when Ariel Sharon stood out there, the former Israeli prime minister and war criminal. He said, Yeled por Yeled, dam por dam, which means a child for a child and blood for blood. Hezbollah used that same line. The Israelis will pay for the blood that they spilled with their own blood. And they retaliated. And over the past 48 hours, we have a total of 7 Israeli soldiers killed and about 10 injured in total. And this is very interesting. It's an escalation because the Hezbollah has ramped up its attacks against Israeli military posts in Kiryat Shmona, in even all the way to Golan Heights, across the Galilee Panhandle, all the way to deep into Israeli occupied territories. We're talking about 15 kilometers beyond the blue line. And that means one thing, that Hezbollah is telling the Israelis, we are ready for war. Now, of course, Hezbollah is not going to go into a fully fledged war unless one of the two stipulations that they had set from the beginning. Either Israel changes its behavior towards Lebanon, which means it increases its attacks against Lebanese civilians all the way deep inside Lebanese territories, or the situation in Gaza changes, and we expect if it changes in Rafah, that would be the cause for Hezbollah to expand the northern front, which means a major enemy for Israel at the moment, which has strategic weapons. We're talking about long-range missiles that can go beyond 500 kilometers. We're talking about possibility of having air defense system. They have attack drones. They have literally just recently, yesterday, confused the third Iron Dome on the northern front, which is now out of service. So you now have Hezbollah deterring 3 Iron Domes. Each one costs about $100 million. So that $300 million of losses for the Israelis. Those people are capable, and the Israelis know that, and they're afraid of it, but somebody is pushing them into that war, and that's the Americans who are supporting Benny Gantz, who has aspirations to become the next prime minister.
Yeah, I can see that. The political talk in the United States right now is putting a lot of blame on Benjamin Netanyahu, so we can kind of see how this is going to shape up, where we just need to, move Netanyahu out. He's gone a bit too far. I can see how the Americans will massage this talking point, and we need somebody more reasonable in there. Benny Gantz is our man, and it just takes one sort of speech by Biden, the Gantz coalition, the Gantz government, or as soon as you start hearing this, then you know that's all that bad will, all of that sort of, angst, all of the anger will sort of be swept away with Benjamin Netanyahu potentially. So I absolutely agree with you on that. That's a nice little short-term political solution for the U.S. and Israel to carry on with their business, because none of this, as you said, is really going to deter the long-term plan. So what is the long-term plan for Israel? Because, pushing Palestinians into Egypt, this is absolutely in the interests of the current ruling clique in Tel Aviv. And I think more broadly, most Israelis will probably be happy to see Palestinians pushed into Egypt, because then it's not their problem anymore. How realistic is this scenario? I hate to paint a dark picture of the future, but we have to be realistic that there are people in power that are right now mapping out this very scenario and how to manage it, how to manage the fallout, etc. Leila, your thoughts on this Israeli expansion, however you want to call it, solving their, quote, Palestinian problem, which they talk about now quite openly. But go ahead.
It's kind of unrealistic for the Israelis themselves, and they know that. What I believe is going to happen, and I'm going to quote our dear friend Phoenix on this matter. He always says that the Palestinians outside of Gaza in Sinai will cause a problem to the Israelis. They will always cause a force of retaliation against the Israelis, and that will always be a thorn in their side that they cannot control because they are not in confined territories. However, if you keep the Palestinians in Gaza in a certain area that's confined and under siege, they can control them and shoot them like fish in a barrel. So realistically, the sane Israeli insane generals, they do prefer to constrict them to a small area, basically perhaps the south, clear all the north and central Gaza. This is what they think about. But it's really hard to do on the ground, because if you have heard what Benny Gantz and other generals had said, that they're going to go back into North Gaza because Hamas has 5,000 warriors who came back over there, etc., which is not true, because they never left Gaza in the first place. They're not sitting at the fence. They're still going and sniping and bombarding Gazans in North Gaza. There are about 600,000 plus Palestinians who are stuck in North Gaza, who are now facing starvation. We know of 22 who have died of starvation over the past 2 weeks, including 7 children. And now basically there are 11 children in total. And at the same time, they are facing also diseases because of what you call contaminated water, typhoid, cholera, hepatitis A, all these diseases. So the Israelis prefer to kick them out all the way to the north and clear out step by step, bit by bit, that land and keep it to themselves. This is unfeasible for a reason. The resistance on the ground is still there. They never left. Second thing is that if at any point they're going to try and do exodus, the axis of resistance will move, they will not leave it as is. Third thing, which is the main important thing, is that the Egyptians refuse to host the Palestinians on their own territories in Sinai, And they're building these fortifications to ban any exodus. If you look at the length of the wall and the way that they built it, it looks like a puzzle rather than a city to engulf or take in basically millions of people. So the Egyptians have a strong army. It's a large army. They do have the air defense system. The Egyptians, I do believe, they will go into war if the Israelis try to force the Palestinians on them. Jordanians, on the other hand, have said it out openly. If you try to push the Palestinians towards Jordan from the West Bank at one point or another, that means war with Jordan as well.
So this is interesting. Back to that original talking point that was pushed out, that Israel's preparing, constructing some kind of structures to take Palestinians in when they're pushed out of Gaza. Quite the opposite, in fact. They're doubling up their fortifications to prevent that outcome, and also preparing for a potential military conflict with Israel should that come to pass. Obviously, Egypt's going to want to avoid that possibility at all costs, and I'm sure it's not in the Israeli interest either, considering everything that's going on. But the worst part about that, if it did come to any sort of shooting or back and forth between Israel and Egypt, that the Palestinians are literally caught in the middle. So that makes it all the more complicated, and it'll be very difficult to, avoid casualties. Either way, chaos could ensue. So if things become very unstable here, wouldn't that provide an opportunity for Hezbollah, for instance, to make more advances in southern Lebanon in order to draw Israeli forces away? Because isn't Israel stretched having to fight a two-front war? They're already very depleted after this operation, which many people will say, while they did flatten northern Gaza for the most part, it wasn't a very big success militarily for the Israelis, but it was a massive success already for Hamas and for the resistance in Gaza. Leila, before the break, I just wanted to get your final thoughts on this. I know you want to open up the conversation to talk about what's happened in Yemen recently, and that's going to bring us into a broader conversation on the axis of resistance as a whole. But as far as southern Lebanon goes, you mentioned that these Patriot missile batteries that Israel, or Iron Dome, they're glorified Patriot missile arrays, they're basically protecting a lot of the sensitive military installations that Israel holds and guards so dear. It's not a big territorial area, so it's not like you can hide in the mountains like in other countries. They're very much exposed, including Israeli air bases as well. So if things escalate right now, doesn't Israel have to be extremely careful about how they escalate? Because one move too far could deal a very serious blow to their whole military operation. If, for instance, where their F-35s are housed or F-16s, if any of these are disabled, that would be a serious blow to Israel militarily, and it would prevent them from doing a lot of what they've enjoyed doing over the last 4 or 5 months. But your thoughts on this, the southern Lebanon front, and what Hezbollah can do potentially, and what risks Israel has?
If at any point you were looking at what was happening over the past 2 weeks, Hezbollah managed to hit Safad. They hit the northern command for the Israeli military in basically in Safad as well. They've hit the air radar defense system that they have over there, the Eye in the Sky for Israel. They've hit critical a critical military factory that does maintenance for the Israeli military equipment and at one point or another armored vehicles. What you say about the airplanes, it is a possible situation, but most of the F-16s and F-35s, they don't fly from the north over Lebanon. They go from Rojdan all the way to Lebanon. That's at least the ones that we know of. However, there's no place in Israel that cannot be not hit by Hezbollah's 500-kilometer plus range missiles. I mean, they can reach beyond Eilat, right? The Israelis learned it the hard way, and that's why at one point or another, they are yet to expand or change their behavior against the southern Lebanese front. So no matter what the army generals on the northern front have been fighting with their government back inside Rojdan and in Jerusalem. And the reason is that they understand fully what's at stake, whereas the government is mostly run by radicals who are trying to push for war at one point or another, and they don't understand the situation on the ground fully as they do. Netanyahu is not the smart army general, for example, like the ones, basically Gadi Eisenkot, who was responsible at one point or another. He's not that smart, but he's smarter than Netanyahu when it comes to fronts and war. The guy has been, he is a veteran general. He's a veteran general. He had launched the war or taken part in the war against Lebanon in 2006. He was behind the Dahi doctrine, which is the carpet bombing of civilian areas in southern Beirut suburbs. So this guy understands what it means when it's losses on the ground. He lost so many soldiers back in 2006. He understands the capabilities of Hezbollah. That's why he's kind of showing self-restraint over there. However, Gadi Eisenkot supports Benny Gantz, and Benny Gantz, if he wants to push for an expansion of the northern front, because the Americans are telling him to do so, Gadi Eisenkot has no other means but to expand that front. I do understand from our sources on the ground that he had sent several messages back to the political command that it would be suicide to go into war against Lebanon at this moment, especially with other fronts open at the same time.
Sure. Yeah, this is something to consider going forward. So all is not well with the Israeli side when it comes to playing this double game of chess. So it's something to very much consider. Now, on the subject of Yemen, Yemen has fallen off the headlines in recent weeks as the escalation with the U.S. airstrikes, the U.S. bombing runs hitting Yemeni targets, hitting also Iraq targets after what happened, allegedly what happened in Jordan. There's arguments about where that happened with the 3 U.S. soldiers killed. What side of the border they're actually on, Syria or Jordan. But let's put that aside. What is the latest from Yemen, and has Ansar Allah withstood these various waves of salvos from the U.S.'s coalition, and what is the latest report there?
Yeah. So you do have to understand how the Yemenis operate. They don't go there for show off, they go directly for the kill. And bless their hearts, those people just are so effective to the extent that the Americans and the British have joined hands together to go and fight them. And until now, they're losing. I mean, the Yemenis have downed several US ships and British ships over the past 2 weeks. They keep going every now and then announcing that they have downed this ship or crippled another ship. The Americans, with all their bombardment and their military advancement when it comes to the sky, air forces, they couldn't do anything to stop Ansar Allah Houthis from firing those missiles or launching these drone attacks against the American and British ships that are trying to cross from Bab al-Mandab or Aden, the Gulf of Aden, or basically the Arabian Sea, all the way to the Red Sea. Now, you have to understand one thing. The Yemenis have done this since the beginning of the war until now without shedding a drop of blood. So they have crippled Israeli maritime trade throughout the past 4 months and a half, 5 months, without shedding a drop of blood. And the reason why they're doing that is to support a ceasefire in Gaza and allow for humanitarian aid to go into Gaza, which actually complies with what the international law says and what the ICJ has ruled as well, the International Court of Justice. So at any point, or the decision, it's not a ruling until now, the Yemenis have been bombarded by the Americans and the British. They recently, today, 2 hours back, were subject to a vicious attack by the Americans and the British Air Force at one point, and still they haven't been deterred. Now, how they operate, they only come out and announce what they have to say, and then just go back into doing what they do normally. The reason why we don't see them in the headlines, they have fallen off the headlines, is because the mainstream media is playing media blackout, because guess who owns the mainstream media? The Americans, the British, and the pro-Israeli entities. So at any point, they don't want to show that they're losing in Yemen against a lesser armed group at one point. So that's why you don't see them in the media.
You also got a recent couple of days ago, U.S. drone downed off the coast of Yemen, and
yes, the MQ-9. The MQ-9. They used a $5,000 to $10,000. Actually, it's a $5,000 worth missile to down something that's worth $30 million. So go figure. Technological advancement does not mean superiority in warfare.
No, that is definitely going to raise eyebrows. It should anyway on the U.S. side. And the Pentagon is now being challenged quite seriously on the idea that all of these U.S. strikes have somehow deterred the Ansar Allah, or the Houthis, as they call them in America, the Houthi attacks and defending the shipping lanes in their territorial waters. So that's becoming a conversation now. Granted, Leila, there's a lot of politics in the United States. They're really pressuring the Biden administration during the election year to kind of put the blame on them. Deservedly so. Obviously, they're in charge. But what's interesting, Leila, is that this argument, this debate is actually happening now, because what will hopefully happen here is a reassessment of the policy itself. So that's what we're hoping. The fact that they're having this debate might lead to a change in policy. But all roads lead back to Israel on this issue. And that's the important thing to focus on, Leila, because I think a lot of people, they're so focused on the fighting between the US, UK, and Ansar Allah in Yemen, and they're forgetting the whole reason for Yemen's sanctions and blockade is to call for a ceasefire to stop the killing in Gaza. So yes, this could all be solved with one phone call, but it hasn't, and that's the unfortunate thing. So do you see, in terms of this situation in the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, in the Red Sea, how do you see this progressing? A lot of people will look at the U.S. naval posture and say that actually they really don't have the layers of support necessary for a sustained naval presence in this type of a situation. Other people will say, no, they have Djibouti, they have the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, there's plenty of support there. But is that really true? Because this is a different type of an operation that the United States has never really had to perform in a very difficult area. What do you see for the future of this standoff right now in the Red Sea and with Yemen?
You had a full coalition of 4 countries aided by the Americans since 2015 until recently, fighting against Ansar Allah Houthis in Yemen. And with all their technological advancement, Air Force, the money that was poured in, the Navy, and everything else that was brought in against the Ansar Allah Houthis, and yet they couldn't deter them. Every 5 minutes, we hear the Americans coming out and say, like, oh, we're going to hit them, we will deter them. And every single time the Americans hit the Yemenis retaliate by downing a $30 million MQ-9 or downing a ship or crippling a British ship. So basically, you cannot deter people who live in their own land and know their land and their waters very well, and they have nothing to lose. The most dangerous people are those who basically have nothing to lose. There's something else that actually supports them, and this is what Sayyid Abdul Malik Houthi said recently, I think it was yesterday or today. He said, we do believe in God and we have faith that God is supporting us. So when you have a really strong faith and you have nothing to lose, that gives you more power to actually go and defend what you're doing, and you believe in what you're doing. And one other thing you have to understand, the Pentagon is talking about it. It's not because they're reassessing their military strength or anything else. It's because they're reassessing their military contracts. Arms cartels and the Pentagon are responsible for arms sales across the world as well. The US is the largest arms dealer in the world. And at any point, if you can down an MQ-9, $30 million worth MQ-9 with a $5,000 missile, most of those who want to buy a defense system will buy the $5,000 missile rather than the Iron Dome or anything else. So it all filters down to money. And you have to understand, numbers are something that's, they have kind of, I have a soft spot for them because I was a macroeconomist. And if you look at it, combine the money with the military factor, you just see basically it's based on contracts, nothing else.
Sure, and that's a sizable portion of the United States' increasingly bloated $1.2 trillion annual defense, but that's the real figure, $1.2 trillion. A lot of those projects, those initiatives, they've been going for decades. Some of them never actually make it to the battlefield, but they still get funding for research, and they still keep the projects going. That's the system we have in America. It's a very inefficient and expensive system, but it's keeps a lot of people happy and making lots of money, and I think that's probably a big driver of it. But just on the issue of Yemen, so they've really from a global position, a lot of people are looking at Ansar Allah in Yemen and saying, well, yep, they're very capable. And so, in terms of the conversation about the axis of resistance, as a result of the last, 5 months, is arguably much stronger, arguably much more formidable, arguably much more highly regarded globally. Not talking about in the Middle East. I'm talking about what the Chinese are thinking, what some of these other countries are thinking when they're looking at this. Brazil, are they thinking to themselves, Leila, well, it looks like there's actors in the Middle East that can take care of business themselves, and they're not requiring external assistance to do that, to manage their own affairs. How is this conversation shifting about the axis of resistance and the Middle East right now, globally?
Well, I do speak to Russian and Chinese sources most of the time, and you have to understand what they have kept saying since the beginning, that because the axis of resistance for the first time is unified, and there's a central communications happening between them, a division between what part each side has to play and when. This is what gave them the superiority. They know the land, they are part of this whole region, and they know what they want, and they've put their demands from day one. Whereas when it comes to the allies of Israel, each one comes from a different side, different interests, different political and financial interests also come to play at one point or another. Some of them are not convinced into going into war. Most of them have financial and economic problems back home. So at any point, they are not unified when it comes to what's happening in the region. However, they all agree that Israel, in one form or another, has to stay over there to keep their interests. So the scale of fighting, not everybody goes wholeheartedly. Not everybody believes in this fight, and that's what causes divisions. There's not a centralized commandship that can command, for example, the British and the Americans at the same time. The Americans want to do something, the British want to do something else. Sometimes they do it together, sometimes they don't. So that actually divides them. Basically, this is how they're losing, and this is how the Chinese and the Russians are looking at it. But you also have to understand, the Chinese are not there to support the axis resistance or anybody else. They do what they have been doing for the longest time. They care for economic expansion. That's why they have a company that's running the port of Haifa, which is owned by the Indians, by the way. And at the same time, they always send their own people. I mean, like, they don't have to be under the government directly, but they sell weapons for both warring sides, no matter what. The Russians, on the other hand, they always stick to their allies. They've never shifted from sticking to their allies, and they are looking at what's happening over here with admiration. I mean, one of the Russian diplomats I spoke with said it's very admirable that they managed to stand their ground for the longest time, especially people in Gaza. Nobody expected them to last this long, Hamas and the PIJ.
No, that's definitely, I think, going to be
his exact word. I'm sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, go ahead.
His exact word was, they showed the Americans as clowns.
Yeah, and also it's the Israeli supporters. They're public. They were told that this was going to be done and dusted in like 2 weeks or something like that, and that they're going to eliminate Hamas. And they haven't. How close have they come to, quote, eliminating Hamas after 5 months?
It's always 2 weeks with them. It's always 2 weeks with them. 2 weeks have gone into 5 months. The Americans, remember when they wanted to launch the war on Yemen with their allies in the GCC, they said it's going to take 2 weeks to 2 months. For Assad, he's not going to stay for more than 2 months. It's always number two for them.
Yeah. So when you see 2 weeks, then you got to get ready to readjust your calendar pretty quickly. So this is very interesting. All these developments are pointing to a very interesting couple of months coming. Obviously, we would like to see a cessation of hostilities for the people in Gaza, for the Palestinians first and foremost. But we also have to also hedge our analysis to look at what could happen should that not be the case. So I think it's very important to look at both tracks. I'm not a black pill or a white pill guy. I'm sort of right in the middle, Leila. So I'm looking at all outcomes, hoping for the best. Obviously, this is one of the worst humanitarian disasters that we've had to witness and bear witness to. The world has witness to in the last 4 to 5 months. So yeah, we really appreciate you joining us on TNT and your analysis on these very, very important issues. Leila Hatoum, veteran journalist based in Beirut, Lebanon. Thank you for coming on the program this week, Leila.
Thank you, Patrick.
There she goes, ladies and gentlemen. Well, top of the hour news headlines are coming up. We've got a lot more on the other side. We've got Basil Valentine. We've got Matthew Russell Lee, Inner City Press, the Julian Assange case in the federal court in the U.S. That will have direct bearing on the extradition case in London. We'll find out all about that and more, all coming up in the next hour. Stick around. We'll see you in a few.